Thank you, John. Good evening. This public forum on redistricting for single member District 3 is now called to order at 6:04 p.m. on Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022, for the purposes stated in the notice for tonight's meeting. Board members present in this meeting room are Trustee Ayers Wilson and myself, Trustee Mike Sullivan. I see no trustees. Flip that over. I see no trustees online. If they join, I'll be sure to introduce them. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's attended tonight, as well in person as well as Zoom. Also like to thank Dr. Quentin Wright from Houston North Victory for hosting us tonight. You and your team, thank you very much. You also have early voting going on, so a lot going on, and you're teaching students as well. So thank you for fitting us all in. Trustee Ayers Wilson, I'd like to turn the floor over to you for any comments, and then I'll introduce Thompson and Horton. And please know that throughout the meeting, I'll ask you if you have any comments or questions, but feel free to interject at any time that you'd like.
Cool, no problem. Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I know it's a cold day, so hopefully it won't be long to get everybody home safely. I do want to just say I think this is awesome that we're meeting, and hopefully we can go ahead and get this thing done. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Ayers Wilson. The presentation by Thompson and Horton and demographic team. Our first order of business is a presentation by our legal and demographic team concerning what redistricting is, the role census data plays in redistricting, the system's census data for 2010 and 2020, and initial proposed maps. Dr. Steve Head is also present in the audience. I'd like to recognize him. Ms. Stein, Mr. Gardner, Ms. McBride, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Trustee Sullivan. And it's such a pleasure to be here tonight with everyone and with the public. We are here tonight to present information regarding the proposed maps, as well as redistricting and census data as it relates to the college system wide, as well as single member District number 3. I am here tonight with my colleagues Annie Stein and Paige Martin sitting in the audience, and joining us soon are the college system's demographer, who is Rocky Gardner, who worked very hard with his colleague Matthew Cluck in developing plans 1 and 2 that we'll be going over tonight. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Annie. So tonight's presentation is divided in several parts. And if you've been watching the board meetings where we have been going over information with the board, tonight's presentation is a combination of several of those presentations, but really geared towards single member District number 3. So really to understand the 2 maps that are being presented, there's some background information that we've got to share with the public, including a legal overview, then the population change analysis, because whenever we talk about redistricting and redrawing maps as a baseline, we have to look at what our population was the previous decade and what it is now as a result of the new release of the census data. That really is the starting point that lets us know where we need to go with respect to looking at new single member district lines. And then we need to look at what constrains how we rebalance our populations in our individual single member districts. And those constraints are the map drawing principles that were adopted by the board, known as redistricting criteria, as well as the consent decree entered into voluntarily by Lone Star College when it went from an at-large system to a single member district system. And so that decree has some limitations on what we can and cannot do with our single member districts. So those 2 things together, the consent decree and the redistricting principles, are sort of the report card to judge any proposed maps by. So how faithful any map is to the criteria, it gets a better grade. And so that is a language that we should be using as the public, as board members, as we're talking about our support or non-support for various maps. Then we'll actually go to the maps once we've given an overview, that population change, the constraints that we have to consider, when looking at maps. Then we'll look at the proposed maps and have an opportunity to talk about those maps. And you're going to have several opportunities as a public to provide comments. You can provide comments today. Obviously, you can provide comment at any redistricting committee meeting. You can provide comment at any board meeting, as well as we're opening up a mechanism on the Lone Star Redistricting website where you can actually include your comments as well. This is not going to be the only round of maps. There'll be another round of maps based on the comments that we received tonight and throughout these single member district community meetings. And we'll do another round of community meetings to seek yet additional public comment before we narrow this down to 1 or 2 maps that we will formally come back to the public with to get some final comments before the board makes a final decision. And that's what's in the next steps, and we'll go over those next steps. So first, I'd like to start with a legal overview of what is this process that we're going through together. And so the what? Redistricting is the process by which the boundaries of elective units, and in a system like this, those elective units are known as single member district units, are periodically redrawn in response to changes in population. Those changes in population are reported to us every 10 years by the Census Bureau by the release of census data. If you'll go to the next slide. And so these are your current single member district boundaries. Those hard, thick, bold blue lines are your current boundaries. And you can see that you have 9 single member districts. They are roughly equal population, although you can see they are various sizes. Single member district 7 is obviously, in terms of geographic land mass, much larger than single member district, let's say, for example, 4. But one of the requirements of a single member district system is that the populations in each single member district be roughly equal. So when this map was originally adopted in 2013, the populations in each of these 9 single member districts were roughly equal. But over the decade, those populations have shifted. People have moved into and out of single member districts. And this process is our response to those population shifts, because we have a duty to keep the population size in each of these 9 single member districts roughly equal. If you go to the next slide. So your 9 single member districts, you have representatives for each of those 9 single member districts. There is a vacancy in single member district number 7. But for your other trustees are listed there on that slide. And if you go to the next slide, the board has delegated some of the duties with respect to the redistricting process to a redistricting committee chaired by Trustee Sullivan. And he is joined on that committee by Trustee Pierce as well as Trustee Murillo. Trustee Pierce is the trustee from District 2. Trustee Murillo is the trustee from single member District 4. So you'll go to the next slide. So why do we have to redistrict? State law says that when that census data that comes out every 10 years, if it indicates that the population between the most populous district and the least populous district is greater than 10%, then we have a duty to rebalance, what is called redistrict. And so we got to shift that population in order to bring the most populous and least populous back into balance, 10% or under. Now, what happens in most systems is the most populous single member district and the least populous single member district are not touching each other. So it's not a simple swap of population. Frequently, they're on opposite sides of the system. So what happens is we have a domino or cascade effect. Every single member district has to either give up or take some population in order for the whole system to maintain that 10% deviation. And that's what you're going to see has happened here when we look at the population changes from 2010 to 2020 and why the 2 proposed maps show changes to almost every single member district. You'll go to the next slide. So when do we have to get this done? We know why we redistrict. We know what the trigger is if that 10% rule is violated. But when do we have to get this done? State law says that we look to 90 days before the first election at which we can act on the release of census data. The census data was supposed to be released April 1 of 2021. Census Day and census information is taken April of 2020, and then a year later, that data is supposed to be released. But guess what? That was right in the middle of COVID. So it didn't get released in April of 2021, didn't get released in May, June, July. It got released in late August. And so that was too late for any entities that were having elections in November of 21 to act on it, because 90 days before November of 2021 was actually before the data was actually released. So for Lone Star that's having an election in November of 2022, that's the first election at which it can act on and implement the results of the census data. So 90 days before November of 2022 is actually August 10th of 2022. But the problem with waiting to that statutory deadline is that is right in the middle between the first day for a candidate to file for a place on the ballot and the last day for a candidate to file for a place on the ballot. So if we waited to that August 10th date, those candidates that are filing for a place on the ballot early on, because the first day to file is about the middle of July, they're not going to know the boundaries within which they need to live within, because we technically could be redrawing maps all the way up until August 8th. So that's why the Lone Star College System Board decided that they wanted to complete this process before that statutory deadline of August 10th of 2022. They decided that they wanted to complete this before the first day to file. So whenever candidates are first filing, they always know the boundaries that they need to live within. And so this process actually completes itself by the end of June 2022. And plenty of time for candidates seeking a place on the ballot to file for a place on the ballot as of the first day to file and actually know what the new map is going to look like. You'll go to the next slide. So how do we do this? Well, I kind of telegraphed how we do it. So we have to take the information that we receive from the census data and make sure that each one of our single member districts, even though they may have expanded in size or contracted in size in terms of population, is of roughly equal population. And we do that by changing the boundaries between the different single member districts and bringing them back within that 10% deviation. And there are a couple of other limitations that we talked about that constrict what we do, those map drawing principles, as well as those requirements from our consent decree that we'll talk about later. If you'll go to the next slide. So every 10 years, we say, or we've talked about that what is crucial to this process is the census data. But what does the census data tell us? That data releases 3 different population figures that are very, very important: total population, voting age population, and citizen voting age population. Total population is a measure of all of the folks in a particular jurisdiction, both people who are over 18 and under 18, those who are citizens or who are not citizens. We're measuring everyone who is surveyed and counted as a result of the census. And that is the figure that we use when we're trying to make sure our single member districts are of roughly equal size. We use that total population number. But we're going to talk about something a little bit later, our requirement to comply with the Voting Rights Act and our requirement to comply with the consent decree, which means that we don't want minority voting strength to be diluted as a result of how we redraw these lines, that when we're measuring voting strength and looking at vote dilution, we don't use total population because that's not a good approximation for everyone who's voting. We look at voting age population and even more specifically citizen voting age population, because you have to be over 18 and a citizen in order to be able to vote. So that's a better approximation of voting strength. Total population and voting age population are direct count numbers as a result of the census. The Census Bureau is surveying people and people are answering questions and they're directly counting those individuals. Citizen voting age population is not a direct count. It's more of a mathematical approximation because we don't ask the citizenship question on the census information or the census survey. So it's the best mathematical approximation of the relationship between citizen and voting age, but it's not a direct count number. If you'll go to the next slide. So we are required to draw single member districts, as I indicated, that are of substantially equal population, but they don't have to be exactly equal. And under our state law, the best approximation for substantially equal is that 10% deviation. The deviation or the difference between the most populous and the least populous is about 10%. And notice that equation, we're looking at population, we're looking at total population. We're not looking at the size of the single member district, the physical size. It says populous for a reason. We're looking at total population. And so the goal with respect to redrawing our single member districts is to avoid single member districts that are overpopulated and underpopulated. And I always give the example, if you took a pie and you divided it in half and thought about half the people on one side and half the people, well, not exactly half, but roughly half of the pie on the other side. But think about 1,000 people being on one side of the pie and 2 people being on the other side of the pie. And each side of the pie, you have the right to elect a representative. Which side would you rather be on? Which side do you think you have greater voting strength? The side where there are only 2 people. Now, none of your single member districts, either in 2013 or now, are that grossly disparate, but that's what we're trying to avoid, underpopulated and overpopulated districts. And so that's why we follow that 10% deviation, and we try to get each one of our single member districts closer to the average size. They don't all have to be that average size, but we want to get them closer so we have a better balanced system. If you go to the next slide. So as I indicated, the first step in this process is to know whether or not we're legally, statutorily required to act on our census data. And the trigger for that is if our most populous and least populous district, as a result of the release of the new data, indicates that it's greater than 10%. If it is, then we are statutorily required to rebalance and to react. So if you'll go to the next slide, Amy, please. Now I'm going to bring in our demographer, Rocky Gardner, to talk about this census data and whether or not we have hit that 10% differential. We'll start with a look back at 2010. Really, this is your data that was in effect for purposes of drawing your single member districts in 2013. And then we'll look at today, 2020, to see where we are and whether we've hit that legal trigger. Rocky, if you'll go over the data, please.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everybody, for having us. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And we're starting here with just the 2010 numbers. I just want you to focus on a few things here. First of all, the district average. So we had 1.786 million persons in Lone Star College back in 2010. That equated to about 198, almost 200,000 persons per district. So that's the average. So what I have highlighted there in red is kind of the sweet spot, if you will. At that time, our smallest district after drawing districts was District 4 with 190,000, and the largest district was District 9 with 204,000. So we're looking at a 7.3% differential. So that was right where we needed to be, and that's going to kind of be our target for 2020 as well. You can see below, we've also got what Lisa described as the voting age population in green, and the citizen voting age population there in kind of the, I guess that's an orange color. You'll notice as well that we've got several districts that are in what we consider influence districts. That District 2, District 3, and District 6 all have at least 50% or greater population when you combine the African-American and Hispanic populations. District 4 is an opportunity district because it is over 50% Hispanic. We got to keep that in mind because we're going to try as best we can to hold on to those opportunities and influence districts. Actually, yes. I think I had that right. Did I get that right? Maybe
you did, Rocky. Excellent.
Thank you. We go to the next slide, please. So this slide's 2020. So in 2020, our population had jumped up to 2,262,909 persons for an average there in red of 251,000. So again, what happens here is we're off by 38.2%. That's because District 4 is still the smallest district with just 202,000 persons. But District 1 has now become 279,000. That differential, 38.2, brings us outside the 10% criteria that Lisa was describing. we can in fact see that although we are outside the differential, we still have influence districts in 2 and 3. District 4 is still an opportunity district with over 56% Hispanic, so it actually increased a little bit there. And District 6 is also a district of influence. Now let's go to the next slide, please. This is a change slide. This slide is simply subtracting 2010 from 2020. You can see your growth there of 476,000 persons. You can see where some of the changes occurred. You know, we saw some pretty strong Hispanic growth at 4.8% change. Your Anglo population dropped by almost 10% as a share. So it didn't necessarily, the share of Anglo population, you look there at the voting age population, dropped by almost 10%, while the other categories grew slightly. Next slide, please. So in District 3, since we're working with Trustee Ayers Wilson tonight, this is the way District 3 looked. This is the way, kind of a little zoomed view and a comparison. So in District 3, population grew from 195,000 to 209,000. So keep in mind, our sweet spot is 251 now. So we know District 3 needs to have quite a bit of population added to it. It was the second smallest. So we're probably going to need to grow District 3 by 30 to 40,000 persons to get back within the 10% criteria. We stayed, you see, if you look at your percentages there, your total voting age percentages decreased a little bit at the Anglo. Your African-American population remained almost the same, and Hispanic population grew in percentage from 32.9 to 40.4. And we saw a similar change. Your African-American CVAP decreased a little bit, while your Hispanic also decreased a little bit. Again, that's your citizen voting age population. I think the next slide is still me. Yep. So again, the college added 476,000 persons from 2010 to 2020, almost 500,000, 500,000 there. Total district population is 2.2 million persons now. The SMDs exceed 10% significantly, 38.2%. Your most populous SMD changed from single member district 9 to single member district 1, although single member district 4 continues to be your least populous district. So redistricting is now required. So we get the fun of drawing plans.
Thanks, Rocky. So now we know that redistricting is required. And we also know that some of our single member districts, as we're rebalancing, like single member district number 3 and single member district number 4, have to gain as much as 30 or 40,000 people in terms of population. But there are going to be some constraints on how we do it. So first, let's talk about the consent decree that I talked about a little bit earlier. This was 2013 consent decree. Prior to 2013, Lone Star College was at large. As a result of resolving this lawsuit, the college agreed to go to single member districts. And if you'll go to the next slide, with 3 requirements with respect to those single member districts. The first requirement is that at least one of the single member districts would be majority Hispanic in terms of citizen voting age population, and that's single member district number 4, and that there would be at least 2 influence districts in terms of the combined citizen voting age population of African Americans and Latinos. And you've always had 3 actually single member districts that satisfy this requirement, both in 2013 and actually today, even before we draw any of the lines. And that's single member districts number 2, this single member district number 3, as well as single member district number 6. And so we have to keep those requirements of the consent decree, even though we are rebalancing our population to come under the 10% deviation. Other things that we have to keep in mind, in addition to coming within that 10% deviation, are the map drawing principles or redistricting criteria adopted by the board. Next slide. And so there are 9 of them. The first one is, as it relates to the boundaries between single member districts, use identifiable geographic and political boundaries when possible. And that just makes sense. When we're going to have the breaks between single member districts, we're going to break them along political or geographic boundary lines. The next two criteria are going to be very familiar because it's what we've been talking about. So important that our single member districts be of roughly equal population. So that's criteria number 2. And criteria number 3 is a statutory criteria that brings us to this process in the first place. We're going to make sure that the most and least populous district are 10% or less in terms of their deviation from each other. Criteria number 4 is that single member districts shall be compact and contiguous. And compactness relates to the way single member districts look. They're squared or rectangled, as opposed to having long drawn out arms and legs that stretch across the district, which tell us that we're drawing single member districts overwhelmingly considering one criteria and not all of them at the same time. But it also relates to political compactness. So keeping neighborhoods together, keeping communities of interest together, help with the more rectangular squared shape of our single member districts. And then being contiguous. Your single member district map in 2013 was contiguous, and it will continue to be contiguous under the 2 plans that are proposed tonight. And what contiguous means that there's no holes in the middle of the district. If you were looking at the district, it doesn't look like a jack-o'-lantern with eyes cut out or a mouth cut out or a nose cut out. If you were to take a pencil and to draw the outer boundaries of all of the single member districts, you could trace those boundaries without having to lift up your pencil. That means it's contiguous. Your current single member district system satisfies that, and so do the 2 plans that are being presented to you tonight. The 5th criteria is that the single member districts shall preserve incumbent constituency relations by taking into account the current residence address of your trustees. That's a very fancy way of saying that we're not going to draw any of your current trustees out of their district. They're going to be able to continue representing their constituents because they reside within their single member districts through their naturally expiring terms. Go to the next slide, please. The last 4 criteria that we have, criteria number 6, we're going to maintain communities of interest and avoid splitting up neighborhoods. That's where we really need to hear from the public, because the public is on the front line. You know your neighborhoods, you know your communities of interest. We really want to hear from you with respect to the 2 proposed maps and any additional maps that we present about whether we've done a good job with respect to keeping neighborhoods and communities together. To the extent possible, we're going to try to avoid splitting county election precincts because that makes us a better election partner with other entities that have elections on our same date, so that our constituents who have a ballot where multiple things are on that ballot don't have to go to more than one polling place. That's always a nice thing. Criteria number 8 takes into account not only the consent decree, which is based on the Voting Rights Act, but also the Voting Rights Act. And so the Voting Rights Act is a compelling justification to use race as a basis to make a decision. So we can use race as a basis of looking at our single member districts and trying not to have any retrogression or vote dilution with respect to our minority voters in comparison to where they were in 2013. But we can only make that consideration to the narrow extent that is required to satisfy the requirements of the Voting Rights Act. And that balancing of doing something in response to a compelling government interest, not violating the Voting Rights Act, but only doing it narrowly, not making a remedy broader than you have to, is also satisfying the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, which says that we typically don't make race-based classifications unless we're doing it to satisfy a compelling government interest, and we're only doing it to the narrow extent possible. So a race-based criteria is only one of the 9. So we're only narrowly considering race in order to avoid violating the Voting Rights Act. And that's a permissible consideration. And then the 9th criteria is what I call, if it isn't broken, don't try to fix it. So we're going to use your current map that has been pre-cleared. The Department of Justice has approved it. A federal court judge has approved it. We're going to use that as the baseline. We're not going to try to reinvent the wheel, and we're only going to make changes to that baseline map to the extent necessary to satisfy these other 8 criteria, as well as the 3 criteria from your consent decree. So the next thing we're going to do is look at the 2 proposed maps. But as the public looking and evaluating those maps, the first question you should ask yourself is, are we back under the 10% rule? If we're back under, that's a check mark. Your next question you should ask yourself, do we maintain a opportunity district, a single member district 4, still 50% or greater Hispanic citizen voting age? If so, then there is another check mark because we've complied with 1/3 of the consent decree. The other 2/3 of that consent decree are, do we have at least 2 other influence districts where you take African-American population and Hispanic population, and together they're greater than 50% of the citizen voting age population in that single member district. If we have at least 2 of those, we get another check mark. We've satisfied the other 2/3 of that consent decree. Typically, those single member districts are 2, 3, and 6. So we want to have 3, not 2. So we get an extra check mark or a check mark plus. And then the next thing you're going to look for is, how well do we comply with these other 9 criteria, the map drawing principles? So though that is the analysis that you do in order to judge these maps. First, are we under the 10%? Then are we complying with the 3 requirements of our consent decree? And then how well do we comply with the map drawing principles? That's how we judge or give a report card to each of the proposed maps. So we're going to start with proposed map number 1. If you'll go to the next slide. And so under Plan 1, I'm going to bring in Rocky in a moment in order to talk about the specific changes, but I want the public to understand when you're looking at a map that's showing a new proposal for what new boundaries should look at, the hard blue lines are the old boundaries, so your 2013 boundaries, or you can think of that as your current boundaries, those hard blue lines. And each of the single member districts are indicated with a number on there, but each single member district has a color. And so whenever you see a color, like for example, look at single member district number 5, it's pink. Notice the blue boundaries that it's between. Look in the north boundary between single member district 5 and single member district 7. Notice how the pink is bleeding over that hard boundary, the old boundary line of single member district 5 in the northeast there. That pink bleeding over means that the new proposed boundary for single member district number 5 is expanding because it's bleeding over its old boundary. And if you look at single member district number 7, notice that blue color of single member district number 7 doesn't make it all the way to its old boundary because single member district number 5 is actually being enlarged. So that means single member district 7 is a little bit smaller. And so that's how you look at a map that includes old boundary lines, which are the hard, bold blue lines, as well as new proposed boundaries that are represented by the color of the single member districts. And Rocky, I'll let you take it away from there.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, and I might just comment before we go to the numbers that if you recall, one of the last criteria was that we don't want to, we don't want to move boundaries unless we have to. And keep in mind, though, because of where what's happened is because of where the least populous districts are and where the most populous ones are, we're kind of having to work our way down. So that's why we're, giving up, a 7's giving up some population to 5, and then 5 is giving up some population to 9, because we're kind of needing to move population down. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And for all of you that were asking yourself questions, I can answer them pretty quickly. Yes, we got down within 10%. We've got our least populous district now, District 4, at 239,000. So you can see we increased District 4 by over 30,000. Our most populous district is still District 9 at 260, but they are within 9%. We look at our voting age population and our citizen voting age population. We still have our opportunity district of District 4, which is over 53%. And then we now have 3, 2, 3, and 6 are all influence districts. So we met that minimum criteria. And I might take a second here to let you know that this was our first attempt. My colleague Matthew and I, we basically each made plans that met the minimum criteria. We spoke with trustees and we garnered as much information as we could before we did these, but we knew they wouldn't be perfect. And we knew that there might be opportunities to make adjustments, and surely we will begin making adjustments. And District 3 is one of those that we have already begun looking at opportunities to try to bring these back into a plan that kind of fits all the criteria, as well as satisfies, Trustee Ayers-Wilson's opportunities as well. Next slide, please. So this is all the areas that changed. We see black circles. That's where we change populations to try to move things within criteria. We're going to zoom into number 3 now in this next slide, I think. Yes. So in SMD3, you can see in the north, right there in District 6, we grabbed some of Trustee Saldivar's, I think, district. And then in the south, we went into Trustee Stoma's district and borrowed some population from there as well to bring the population of District 3 up. Next slide, we zoom in a little bit. This change here, you can see we use Freeman Road at the top, Greenhouse Road to the west, going down to Keith Harrow Road and Fry Road. We tried to keep this as clean as possible. So when we make this move, we didn't believe we were splitting neighborhoods, and we were also trying to be cognizant that we needed to keep District 3 and a district of influence as well. Next slide, please. This was the northern part. Walnut Glen Drive comes over from District 6. Again, it looked like a very smooth change there. It was kind of crooked before. We thought that would be an opportunity to smooth that out as well. Next slide. So with Plan 1, SM3 gains population from SMD6, from District 6, and from District 1. Both were population increases for District 3. Next slide. So Plan 2 is a little bit different. You can see the changes. Now you can see we're 8 bled into 7 to get a little bit of 7 there. You can see that not as much of 5 was taken to bleed into 9. So it shifts out a little bit, but next slide, please. Drum roll, we're still within 10%, 9.2% differential. District 4 being the smallest. We picked up a few more persons in District 4 in this plan with 240,000. Now the largest district is now District 2 with 262,000. But if you see our criteria at the bottom, District 4 is still an opportunity district with over 52% population of Hispanics. And your influence districts, 2, 3, and 6, still remain over 50%. So we still met our minimum criteria. We'll look at some of those changes. There's the black circles popping up again where color passes through the dark blue lines in several places. And if we jump into District 3, next slide, please. This is on that southwest side again. This is where Trustee Ayers-Wilson district is going to go into Trustee Stoneman's district. Now in this plan, we just squared it off. We took Freeman Road all the way to Fry South. So it's a large segment of population there, a dense area, and it did increase District 3's population. Next slide. It did increase district population at District 3 enough that we actually had to move some population, or it gave us an opportunity to move some population up into District 4, which, if you recall, was the smallest district. So in this plan, SMD3 actually gives up some population to SMD3 there on the north side. Kind of squares it off around that Gulf Bank Road. Next slide. So again, single member District 3 loses population to 4, but gains population from Trustee Thomas at District 1. Data comparison of the plans. This is one of my favorite slides. Next slide, please, because this puts everything all together. So like we said, District 3 was 195,000 in 2010, grew to 209,000, of course, below our 250,000 average. But you can see both these plans, it gets up to 244,000, which helped it get within the 10% tolerance. You can see that our voting age populations, we didn't see a large shift. We're really at this point focusing on 2020 because the change from 2010 to 2020 is really, there's not a lot we can do about that change, but you can see that we held on to the Anglo population. It was very close to 24%. The same with your Asian, African American, they stayed right close to that 22%. All percentage across the board and voting age population stayed very good. The same with your citizen voting age population. We actually increased the opportunity there, the African American population slightly there in Plan 1, a little bit lower in Plan 2. And in both Plan 1 and Plan 2, we increased the CVAP of the Hispanic population in both those plans. Next slide. Here we go. Ready for the hard questions.
Thank you, Rocky. Now, Trustee Sullivan, Trustee Ayers-Wilson, would it be appropriate to entertain questions either from either of you or from the audience?
You through with your presentation?
The only thing we have left, Trustee Sullivan, is next steps and timeline.
Okay, very good. I'd like to give Trustee Ayers-Wilson an opportunity to ask questions, please.
Thank you. Great presentation. I do know that I did have a meeting set up coming in March because constituents have reached out and they were concerned about how the lines are looking and where District 3 is moving, and they want to make sure that it's maintaining the integrity that they think it's supposed to maintain. So I don't have any questions at this time. I'll just wait to my one-on-one. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay,
thank you. And we'll come back to you before we adjourn, just so if any other thoughts or comments come to mind, you'll have another opportunity, of course.
Thank you.
Before we go to timeline, should I ask for question and answer from the public?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. Well, now I'll open the floor for questions and or comments from the public. If you're physically present, please come up to the microphone to speak. If you're online, please use the action icons in Zoom to virtually raise your hand or post your question in the chat and we will read it aloud. Whether in person or by Zoom, please state your name and the single member district in which you live before stating your question or comment. We will alternate between calling on those in the audience and those participating remotely. And I am looking in Zoom. Back up. I do not see any hands raised. And go to chat. And I do not see any questions. So we'll move to the next item, discussion of timeline and next steps. Ms. McBride or Ms. Stein, will you present the timeline and next steps, please?
Yes, sir. So on the next two slides is the board adopted timeline for redistricting. February 9th was the special board meeting on redistricting where the board received the initial maps. And between that February 9th meeting and the March 24th redistricting committee meeting is when we're having a series of single member district meetings in each single member district to receive public feedback. But again, the public can also submit feedback directly on Lone Star College's redistricting website regarding the two maps. That feedback is critical because it will drive, along with trustee feedback, the next iteration of maps before we come back out for another iteration of community meetings. So we have a redistricting committee meeting on March 24th. We'll consider trustee feedback and public feedback to begin recommending another iteration of maps to the board on April 13th of 2022. And that iteration of maps will be released to the public after that April 13th board meeting. If you'll go to the next slide. April 21st of 2022, we'll have another redistricting committee meeting where we'll consider additional trustee input and public feedback received to date in order to make a recommendation back to the board regarding the last iteration of maps. The May 11th, 2022 special board meeting on redistricting will be the board's opportunity to narrow down the maps to one or two so that those one or two maps can be presented on the system's website and presented to the public at a formal hearing on June 8th of 2022. Based on the feedback from the public at that June 8th public hearing, the redistricting committee will meet on June 16th to make any final tweaks to the map to be presented to the board on June 29th, where the board will take final action to adopt one of those two maps that we had a public hearing on. And that gets us through the redistricting process. Another way of looking at that process graphically is on this slide, including the community input or community input forum sessions that are broken out at the bottom of that slide. But you can see that this process started roughly in November of 2021 and will end at the end of June of 2022, which puts us in great timeline with respect to the upcoming election in November of 2022. If you'll go to the next slide. So our immediate next steps, since the board has reviewed the initial maps, or to make sure those initial maps are on the website and to receive public comment either through the website or through these community meetings. Next slide. So on this slide and on the next one, we have listed our community meeting dates. Round 1 community meeting dates are listed on the first slide. They're always at 6 p.m. and we have one in all of the single member districts, and we've indicated the trustee that represents the single member district. And the next slide shows round 2. Round 2 begins on April 18th and ends on May 3rd, well in advance of that final hearing on the single member districting maps. If you'll go to the next slide. The website for redistricting for Lone Star is at www.lonestar.edu/redistricting, where you can always get the most up-to-date information regarding redistricting, including the presentations at these community forums, as well as the presentations that have been presented to the board, as well as the current maps being considered by the board. So all of that current information is on that redistricting website. Also on that website are the links to our community meetings in case you want to attend virtually any of the community meetings in your single member district or for another single member district. And with that, Trustee Sullivan, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you. Trustee Ayers-Wilson, any comments or questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Seeing still no one has signed in to speak. I have no raised hands. I have chat open and nothing in chat. So if outside counsel does not object, I'll adjourn the meeting.
That's fine. Thank you.
Dr. Head. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone at Lone Star for the support in getting preparation for the meeting. Dr. Wright, thank you again for hosting us, and appreciate the hospitality and use of your facilities. Being no further business to discuss, this public education forum is now adjourned at 6:50 p.m. on February 23rd, 2022. The next special board meeting on redistricting is April 13th, 2022. The redistricting committee will hold a public meeting on March 24th, 2022. Thank you.